Hello, BookTube. We're going to trek on with Boldly Govember, the month-long read-along in November that was started by Matt at Paperback Junkie, designed to celebrate all things Star Trek, where all you have to do to qualify for Boldly Govember is read a Star Trek book of any kind in the month of November. And I have been overdoing it because I have a lifelong love affair with Star Trek. And I thought today that I would backtrack just a bit because, as I kind of sort of predicted, my short video on the novels of Star Trek The Next Generation evoked howls of protest. It turns out that, true to form, I do indeed have some Next Generation fans among my viewers. And in that video, I was peremptory about the show and about the fiction that it inspired. I pretty much implied that there's been no good Star Trek The Next Generation novels. And I pretty much implied in that video that the reason why is because of the show, because there's not much for writers to work with. And in this video, I wanted to add a little detail to that for those of you who had your dilithium crystals chipped just a little by my brusque dismissal of your favorite incarnation of Star Trek. And to those people, to those Star Trek The Next Generation fans, I really want to point out one essential thing about the version of the show that you grew up with and that you love so much. And that essential thing is that Star Trek The Next Generation is poop. It is a gigantic garbage truck of bad ideas from start to finish, from literally the first few minutes of the first episode all the way to the very end, 7 long, talkative years later, with almost no glimmers in all of that time of anything that reflected the genuine spirit of Star Trek. Instead, you have, well, what do you see when Riker first enters the bridge of the Enterprise D? What do you see? A vast expanse of open space with little islands of workstations in the middle. And everyone on the crew is extremely physically fit and wearing pajamas. And the captain of this new Enterprise, the Enterprise D, which is a gigantic super fortress, 4 times as big and powerful as the Starship Enterprise, the captain is a frail elderly fellow who's never happy and evokes no loyalty from his crew, is largely a managerial figure, and who in the course of those 7 years makes it very clear that his ideal choice of vocation is not commanding a starship. It's not even being in Starfleet. It's completely elsewhere. He just went into Starfleet and stuck around, taking promotions as they came without anything in the way of gallantry or heroism or loyalty displayed or offered, so that when we meet him, he is the cold and forbidding intellectual CEO of the Enterprise D. And the Enterprise D is nothing to write home about either. It's a big, powerful ship, yes, but it has 2 conceptual flaws that are each chilling, especially in terms of their inherent drama. First one is that families and small children are now on board the Enterprise. They're now going on adventures, and that implies something that we see in the early seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That implies a Starfleet that is unchallenged, a Starfleet that has largely outgrown the dangers that Kirk and company encountered everywhere in the original show. Otherwise, it would be unconscionable to bring children into space. This has to be sort of a field trip science expedition. That has to be what Starfleet has become, or you wouldn't have little children on board the ship. That's one dramatic trouble sign for the Next Generation. The other dramatic trouble sign that's far more disturbing is that the saucer section, the command section of the Enterprise D, is capable of detaching itself from the rest of the ship and flying away on its own power. Horrible. A horrible signal that sends. What does that mean? It means that the captain can get away from trouble without his crew. It's just unconscionable. But the show gives us the standard variation on the Star Trek command crew, which is full of misfits, one way or another. There's a very emphatically human doctor who has a tangled romantic and personal connection to the captain because of her dead husband. It's evoked a few times early on in the season, and then nothing more is done with it. It certainly doesn't ever feel real. The first officer, Commander Riker, is clearly a stillborn captain. It's clear that we would have had a very different show if he had been captain instead of this bloodless aristocrat that is his boss. And we can easily picture Captain Jean-Luc Picard firing someone for a procedural reason, that's anathema to the original Star Trek. In other words, we can easily picture Jean-Luc Picard as a bad boss, the kind of bad boss that all of us have had at one point or another, and we don't sing their praises. we don't consider them to be pioneers in the legacy of Jim Kirk. But even when you go beyond that, the bridge of the Enterprise D, the captain's chair sits equally in a row with the first officer and a chair reserved for the ship's counselor. What on earth is the ship's counselor doing in a command position next to the captain on the bridge of a starship? And this particular ship's counselor, Deanna Troi, we're told that she's half human and half Betazoid, and that the Betazoids are a telepathic, empathic species. She is not a full telepath. Instead, she's an empath. She can sense the feelings of people around her. The limits of her abilities are never described. Sometimes she can't tell when someone in the room is plotting murder. Other times she can sense hostile intention from, hundreds of miles away. and as a result, she becomes right away a classic in-joke, a meme for the whole show, where the Enterprise will be rocking back and forth under a continuous phaser fire from a malevolent enemy who keeps his face shadowed in darkness. And after 15 minutes of that, with the captain doing nothing to save his ship, with no one making any executive decisions at all, after 15 minutes of lights going off and crew members flying across the room, Counselor Deanna Troi will say, "I sense hostility." A complete waste of a character. Complete inert personality, and so on and so forth. You have a boy, Wesley Crusher, who is the son of the Doctor and who is often on the bridge. Didn't go to Starfleet. He's on the bridge of the flagship of the Federation. And you have an engineer who has mechanical eyes, but nothing is ever made of that. Nothing is ever. That is never explored. The ramifications of that are never explored. It's just a gimmick that's put in there to make him look different. And worst of all, there's a Klingon security officer. There is a security officer named Tasha Yar who implies that she's had a rough life. And the show did perk up my interest early on by killing her. A space enemy, an amorphous space enemy, kills her, and that's just it. She just dies in the line of duty. That perked my interest up, but then I immediately fell back to sleep because the show just kept on murmuring along. And the Klingon Worf becomes important later on in the series, but at the beginning he also is kind of a joke. And worst of all is the android crew member, Commander Data, who was made in a laboratory by a human scientist. And yet, when we meet him, he has risen in the ranks. He is lieutenant commander. People take orders from him. Humans, aliens, biological beings all over the Enterprise take orders from him. Even though, easily reachable, on his back, there's an off switch. If you flick that switch, he goes inert. And he cannot restart himself. Someone else has to do that. And there's an episode early on in the show's history where whether or not he is even a life form, whether or not he's even a being, as opposed to an object, is examined in a court of law. And I was watching that episode and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is fairly skillfully scripted, but come on. Either Federation law and society would, in the 24th century, have reached a point where no one questions that this android can be a ranking officer on the flagship of the Federation, and so there wouldn't be no trial. Or there is a question, in which case he never would have become, in which case there still wouldn't have been a trial. Instead, there would have been an inquiry into the workspace of the human who made him. And I realize the show was made 30 years ago, but there are androids now being made by MIT and Mitsubishi that can solve problems. They can walk around, they can jump, they can pivot, they can converse. And obviously, you look at those things, you look at the absolutely chilling YouTube videos of what those things can do, and you realize that we're no more than 5 or 10 years away from having to decide as a society ourselves what we think of those things. You put self-correcting and self-learning intelligence program inside the head or the circuitry of one of those things and give it independent movement and maybe a renewable power source. Have you created a life form? Can you shut it down if it's learning things? And if you've given it a program that gives it pleasure by learning things, can you then? We're obviously going to have to face those decisions soon, now in the beginning of the 21st century. So it's unthinkable that there would be so many open questions around data in the 24th century. And the real heartbreaker is that no matter how interesting or not any of this stuff is, nothing's ever done with it. Virtually nothing is ever done with it. In 7 long years, there are all sorts of discussions. There's all sorts of technobabble. Oh my God, Star Trek The Next Generation invented technobabble. All of a sudden, we don't have Scotty hanging onto the chain link in front of his engines. And all of a sudden, we have characters spouting stuff that they don't make any sense out of, and we're not supposed to understand it. I'm sure that, like most people, I learned the word algorithm from Star Trek The Next Generation. Still have no idea what they are. Inertial dampeners, a ton of other things. Just that kind of gobbledygook was designed to emphasize, designed by the writers and Gene Roddenberry, to emphasize the high-tech nature of this 24th century vision, that this isn't just cowboys in space, which is how the original Star Trek was derisively described, and also worshipfully described by Roddenberry himself, that rather this is the embracing of technology, of the new world of technology. But it doesn't have that effect. It has a distancing effect, not an embracing effect. You start to wonder what any of it means. You don't know what a recursive algorithm is or a dampening field is, but you know perfectly well that if Jean-Luc Picard wants to, he can separate the saucer section from the rest of the ship. That has a visceral impact that no amount of technobabble can soften. So you put all of that together. Of course, the show, you'd started to rack up awards, started to get serious network money put behind it. So if you have that, of course, you're going to attract talented people. The 2 people who were largely in control of the show and governed its continuity were very talented people, very smart people, and they brought on a lot of great talent. So in the course of 7 years, of course, you're not going to have no good episodes. There are good episodes. But that's with everybody bringing it together with a huge budget involved. The books? Oh my God, the books? No, there's nobody overseeing or caring at all about the books. And how can you make drama out of such tepid stew? These mannequins who don't know or like each other. Is there anything more awkward anywhere in Star Trek than bringing these characters together around a poker table and acting like they're friends when there's no chemistry at all in any way? And we have to wait 7 years. 7 years. To the very last minute of the very last episode of the very last season for the captain to decide that, maybe I might like to be part of this poker game. They would never have invited him. They don't like him. It's just incredibly awkward. So actually, you Next Gen fans, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that your show should be hauling garbage. I meant to say that it should be hauled away as garbage. However, a little original series for fun for some of you. I realized after I came to this show is just garbage. There are a handful of good episodes. Most of it is junk, and most of the novels that came from it is just sententious junk. There is no sense of electricity, personality, adventure. None of that. You have to go elsewhere in the Star Trek franchises to get that. Instead, it's a safe space, and who wants Star Trek to be that? But as I was thinking about it, I realized there are a couple of Next Generation novels that I can recommend. In fact, I strongly recommend them, and I really like them. And they're both written by Diane Carey, and they have one thing in common other than authorship, and that is that they don't deal with Star Trek The Next Generation. They deal with the original show. The first of them is one of the best Star Trek novels ever written, and that is Ship of the Line by Diane Carey. And that is, you're not seeing things. Those of you who don't know your Star Trek really well, that is indeed Kelsey Grammer. That is Morgan Bateson, a 23rd century starship captain who is thrown into the 24th century and directly into the path of the Enterprise D by some sort of temporal anomaly. He can't get back. He and his crew can't get back. So they are stranded 70 years in the future. And they remember Kirk and Spock. Kirk and Spock make an appearance in the beginning of this novel. It turns out they meet the Bozeman, Morgan Batesman's ship, just before it enters into the temporal anomaly. But most of the plot of the novel takes place later. Morgan Bateson, we learn that he and his crew are adapting to life in the present day. This novel also takes place after the Star Trek The Next Generation episode that reintroduces Captain Montgomery Scott. Scotty, it turns out, in his retirement, the ship that he was on crash landed, and in order to save his life, he, on the fly, invented a way to keep himself in the transporter machine, constantly regenerating his energy pattern until such time as he could be materialized again. That's a classic Scotty idea. And it works. So he is back, in the hale of health in the 24th century. And he's in this novel too. He and Morgan Bates and Commander Riker and a whole bunch of other characters have a great adventure against the Klingons in the course of this novel. But half of the novel's plot involves Jean-Luc Picard on a separate mission, alone, into Cardassian space. And on his way there, he's had a crisis of confidence. Not that anybody cares or would even notice, but he's had a crisis of confidence. And on his way to this adventure, Riker has given him a series of interactive holosuite programs. So they're not just that you tell the computer to go and then you enter into whatever storyline. They were made by Starfleet with the participation of the people involved in order to be learning exercises, command learning exercises. And the program involved here is Balance of Terror, a classic Star Trek episode in which Kirk has a duel out in the depths of space with a Romulan commander. After years and years of a tense treaty, there's now the threat of war. If the encounter between the Enterprise and this Romulan ship that it never sees until the end go poorly. It's a fantastic original episode, just fantastic. Barely has a slack second anywhere in it. It's ironically, I'm sure that it wasn't Diane Carey's intention, but it ironically underscores the difference between the original series and The Next Generation. The Next Generation almost cannot ever field an episode anywhere near as good as Balance of Terror. And Balance of Terror is not the best Star Trek episode, the best original show. So it just goes to show you the gigantic creative disparity between the two. But in that mission, before he gets to where he's going, Picard goes into that episode. He goes into that adventure. And it gives Diane Carey a chance to write that episode, which had not been written, aside from James Blish's very sketchy attempt to write out just the working television script, without any atmosphere, without any kind of Diane Carey obviously sat and watched Balance of Terror minute by minute, noticing things. There's one point where she notices a small detail of something happening on the bridge that I had to go and check. And sure enough, she's right. She spotted it and I never did, and I've watched it a million times. It's fascinating. Fascinating. Not so much for Captain Picard. He's largely a dead letter. But watching her write about the original show, the original crew, in this setting, in this adventure that we all know so well, is just amazing. And there's one moment that I want to read to you where Kirk has been dueling, basically, with this Romulan commander, long distance, mostly not being able to see the Romulan ship, for a long time now. And he's not quite sure how things are going to go and whether or not intergalactic war will result from his actions. And we break to find him in his cabin. There's a long waiting game going on board the Enterprise. They're just waiting for their enemy to make a mistake. And Kirk figures it won't do the crew any good for me to be sitting on the bridge the whole time. So he goes to his cabin and lets down his armor. And McCoy finds him there. And if those of you who know your original Star Trek really well will love this moment. You'll remember it vividly. It's a fantastic moment. And Diane Carey describes it so well. Maybe he's not out there at all. The doctor offered, this is McCoy. McCoy comes to Kirk's cabin, lets himself in, just without permission, just as McCoy does. Maybe he's not out there at all. Doctor offered, leaning back against the doorframe. Maybe you've destroyed him without even knowing it, or he might have gotten away, in which case, Captain, we are sitting here in violation of the treaty. James T. Kirk, the legendary rake hell of Starfleet, the man most revered and most also mocked by cadets, the shipmaster's shipmaster, now sat here in a puddle of sorrow, looking about as spirited as a wet rug. Anyone who thought James Kirk could not be wearied, could never be parried by turbulence, had never seen him like this. For Picard, this was a kind of revelation. The man was simply completely different than he had been on the bridge. Kirk's airbrushed brows were flat now, drawn. His eyes were rounded with hurt, not at all like the slim weapons they had been on the bridge. As Picard watched, he saw before him a man who was his own tragic flaw. "Why me?" the young captain murmured, looked up beseechingly at Dr. McCoy. "I look around that bridge, and I see the men who are waiting for you to make the next move. And Bones, what if I'm wrong?" Silence dropped instantly over those words like a muffler, for there was no good answer, certainly no right one. Boxed in, McCoy licked his lips and began, "Captain, Kirk stood up abruptly. "No, I don't really expect an answer." But the doctor caught him by the shoulder as Kirk tried to slip past. "Well, I've got one. Something I rarely say to a customer, Jim. In this galaxy, there's a mathematical probability of 3 million Earth-type planets, and in all the universe, 3 million galaxies like this one. And in all of that, and perhaps more, only one of each of us." Now the doctor turned his head, but didn't quite look directly at his captain. "Don't destroy the one named Kirk." In silent appreciation, Kirk did not answer. He gave a small grin of thanks, slipped out from under the doctor's hand, and disappeared into the corridor. That is just wonderful. That is just wonderful. That is, of course, well beyond the capability of a well-meaning hack like James Blish. and of course, Diane Carey can't help herself. Yes, Picard viewing these tapes is serving her plot, but she can't help herself. She has to keep narrating the key dramatic moments of this episode, which of course includes the end. The fantastic final conclusion of Balance of Terror, which she writes about. Let's see here. Gasping, the Romulan struggled across his demolished bridge, hardly a step or two, grasped a support beam just above the viewing mechanism, then paused. He could see them now. He knew they could see him. For the first time, the two commanders gazed into each other's eyes, each seeing the other. Kirk must have been something to gaze at for the first time. Picard took a moment to appreciate that. Like George Washington's face, James Kirk's was known to everyone. Not so for this Romulan, who had been so tightly engaged with Kirk for the past many hours, and had watched his important mission crushed by this unseen captain. Probably years upon years of preparation had been snuffed today. And among those here, only Picard knew how very long it had taken the Star Empire to recover from this hard start. "Captain," Kirk said politely now. There wasn't a hint of gloating in his manner. If anything, he seemed nearly apologetic. But he did not apologize, and that was important. Did not even voice his regret that this had happened. Whatever he actually regretted it, Picard couldn't really tell. "Standing by to beam your survivors on board our ship," Kirk said. "Prepare to abandon your vessel." "He won't," Picard grumbled. "No, it is not our way." Squeezed by a grip of pain, the Romulan's body flinched, but his eyes did not. He surveyed Kirk with disclosed warmth. "I regret that we meet in this way. You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I could have called you friend." With clear sorrow, Kirk attempted to persuade the Romulan. "What purpose will it serve to die?" "We are creatures of duty, Captain. I have lived my life by it. Just one more duty to perform." The Romulan took one more look at the man he wished he could call friend, then pushed away from the viewer and stumbled across the smashed deck. Kirk took a breath to argue, perhaps to order a tractor beam or an emergency beam out, perhaps to talk his enemy out of a useless end. Then he held back. He closed his lips. Precious seconds drained away as the injured Romulan on the screen staggered to a control panel, made a small adjustment, and twisted a partially jammed handle. A flash of energy wash, a grimace of pain, a crackle of overload, and the screen faded to black in the mindless void of open space. Stars twinkled in the distance as if nothing had happened here at all. At first, Picard almost spoke up. Transporters could snatch those survivors off that ship. Useless sacrifice, etc. Then, in an instant, he knew better. As if he had been delivered a message by intravenous injection, he completely absorbed the depth of Jim Kirk's understanding of being a soldier. Anything Kirk might have said would have taken away that Romulan's last shred of pride. Despite what Kirk had just done, he gave his enemy that little bit of advantage, a chance to control his last moments. Kirk had let him lose his life, but keep his pride. This Romulan, who had murdered hundreds of Federation citizens, was being offered a civilized hand as a final gesture. Strange. That hadn't been the image of James Kirk, which had filtered forward through time. The tender side had never been given much due in history. But Kirk remained silent, choosing not to diminish his enemy's last act. That was elegant of you, Picard mentioned, thinking aloud. We hear about the valor, nobility, the fighting talent, your ability to map a space battle in your head and always know where your ship was and the other ships are. We know about your deeds of strength and your tricks, but until I stood here and watched you, I never knew about your mercy. You could have saved his life. And wrecked his dignity. Kirk's tone was clear sadness, as if indeed he had lost someone. He wasn't proud of himself. He was genuinely sorrowful at what he had been forced to do. Of course, that couldn't be anybody. That doesn't have to be Picard. The drift of that storyline of Picard watching Kirk in some of his tensest moments of command, that's not the only one that we get in this book, is to create an explanation for the stilted and awkward decisiveness that we see in Picard in the next movie. where he says, a line must be drawn here. In that movie, we don't really know why suddenly Picard acts like he has a tiny amount of testosterone flowing through his body, whereas before he's never acted that way at all. He's acted more like an android than Data. And the movie doesn't explain it. And so Diane Carey took it on herself to try and explain that maybe this is the reason why Picard acts that way. It doesn't stick. It doesn't stay that way even in the course of that one movie, and it's gone by the next one. But nevertheless, the descriptions here of Diane Carey writing up some key moments in the original show made me wish, yet again, that Paramount would authorize science fiction authors to write books of the original series. I mean, yes, we venerate James Blish. Yes, of course. All of us have read his extremely thin treatments of the TV shooting scripts. Even when the names are wrong, we still appreciate them because, we had nothing else. But those episodes are now canon. Now, some of them are junk, but quite a few of them are not. Quite a few of them are very good. Can you imagine a novel of Balance of Terror? A novel of Who Wants for Adonis? A novel of Amok Time? I would love that, and I don't see the downside to doing it. A whole novel. So, in other words, giving us all of that detail, that level of background and texture. I would love that, and I hope someday that it happens. But in the meantime, this, at least technically, is a Next Generation novel that I can recommend. And so is another one. There's another one here. Once the show started occurring in many different incarnations and across many time periods, one of the gimmicks that Star Trek writers tried to come up with was plot lines that could involve everybody, which is tough to do because you would have to, in order to involve the original show, you would now have to have a plot line that stretches over a century. And in order to involve Star Trek Voyager, which we will get to, you have to have a plot line that involves the other side of the galaxy. And that's tough to do. And yet it was done effectively a couple of times. One of the less successful attempts was this thing here, Red Sector, Double Helix. This is a medical thing where a medical... a genetically engineered, weaponized disease begins in the era of the Next Generation and then has extrapolations throughout all the different iterations of Star Trek. And this is one that this was one chapter in that ongoing story that takes place in the continuity of the Next Generation. As you can see, that is a very old Leonard McCoy and an old Mr. Spock. This is McCoy at the age and appearance at which he sees off the U.S. Enterprise D in Encounter at Farpoint, the first episode. And this is the Mr. Spock in his Romulan garb from the two-part episode of the Next Generation, where we meet him on Vulcan, trying to engineer the reunification of the Romulan people and the Vulcan people. And in this novel, Spock is drawn away from those diplomatic efforts by this medical emergency that he thinks Dr. McCoy might be able to help with. And they have adventures in this novel, thankfully, like with a line of Ship of the Line. There's very little of the Next Generation in here. It's mostly characters that Diane Carey makes up, including a young commander named Styles, who is the grandson of a character who appears for one episode in the original show. And not particularly favorably until it's actually Balance of Terror, where he appears. He's not particularly favorable until he has a change of heart. It's the kind of emotional payoff episode that the Next Generation virtually never bothers to give us. Virtually never bothers to give us anything along the lines of anything like that, of characters changing, growing, or improving. But this is mostly the adventures of McCoy and Spock, and there is a moment in here that I want to read to you where Styles has brought the aged Mr. Spock. He's still in the prime of life for a Vulcan. He's brought him to the Enterprise D, to the bridge of the Enterprise D, and he is following Captain Picard and a bunch of officers onto the bridge. And it's his first time going to the bridge of the Enterprise D in quite some time. And it's wonderfully done. This is Diane Carey at her best. There have been over 50 major outbreaks of raids and attacks on the neutral zone by angry Romulan commanders who before this had no violent overtures at all, and with no apparent reason. We've got to have some better intelligence. Captain Jean-Luc Picard's comment would not generally have traveled beyond the ears of his first officer and the physician who stood at his side on the command deck, but Ambassador Spock's Vulcan hearing brought the private conversation to him as he stepped from the turbo lift. There were troubled times. These were troubled times. Despite them, reverie clouded his thoughts. To step from a turbolift, to hear the sibilance of the door and the sense of anticipation, the murmur of a starship's bridge electrical system softly working, these were mighty memories. For a brief moment, in a frozen pocket of his mind, the carpet changed texture. The bulkheads drained from tan to blue-gray. The rail turned glossy red. The lights dimmed, and there were crisp shadows over his head. More blue, more black, and at the center, that oasis of Mesa gold. The center of his universe, that dot of gold. Meaning Jim Kirk. And that is just wonderful. That is just wonderful. And moments like that occur throughout this book. That's the reason that I've held on to it. And that corrects my record. There are a couple of Next Generation novels that I can recommend. Mainly because they don't deal with Star Trek The Next Generation and any of its mannequin clothing store display window characters. But we'll be talking about The Next Generation again later on in Building Govember when I give a rundown of episodes for the true nerds among you. But for now, I wanted to make sure to rectify that little lapse. So now that we've done The Next Generation, we're going to move on and talk about other iterations of Star Trek. That'll be coming up. So I will wrap this up for now, hideously long as usual when you get me going on Star Trek. But I'll be back. Thank you, Book 2.